A billionaire walked into her diner, but when his wallet slipped open, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A photograph of her mother, a simple black woman who had lived an ordinary life, raising her daughter alone. Her mother had no known connections to wealth or power, so why was her picture in the wallet of a white billionaire? Stay until the end to discover the truth that shook her world, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sky was still dark when Emma Mitchell began her shift at Rosie's Diner, a modest restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago. The flickering neon sign outside cast a bluish glow through the windows, creating dancing shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor. At 28, Emma had grown accustomed to the night shift routine. The soft hum of the coffee machine, the scent of grease lingering in the air, and the occasional lone patron seeking a place to escape their own thoughts. This was her 5th year waiting tables there. After her mother, Evelyn, had died of cancer, leaving her alone in the world. Nursing school tuition wouldn't pay itself, and Rosie's offered enough flexibility for her to attend classes during the day. The dream of becoming a nurse was something she had shared with her mother, who had worked as a health aide her entire life in a small community clinic. The diner's walls were decorated with old black and white photos of 1960s Chicago, alongside framed newspaper clippings about celebrities who had occasionally stopped by. Emma knew every story behind those images. Rosie, the elderly owner, loved to recount them to anyone who showed interest. The little restaurant sat strategically between the city's upscale district and middle-class neighborhoods, ensuring a diverse clientele, though rarely anyone truly important appeared there. Most customers were night shift workers, truck drivers, or occasionally young people returning from parties in the early hours. Emma was wiping down the counter with a damp rag, distracted as the wall clock struck 2:23 a.m. Her shift ended at 3 a.m., and she already felt the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. The old radio behind the counter played a soft country tune, like a soundtrack to the loneliness of the night. That's when the bell above the door jingled, announcing a customer's arrival. Emma looked up, automatically forcing a smile. It was part of the job, after all. But the man who entered looked nothing like the usual crowd. His dark, perfectly tailored suit stood out completely against the surroundings, as did his erect posture and the discreet gleam of an expensive watch on his wrist, probably worth more than Emma's rent for a semester. He walked with a silent confidence. As someone accustomed to being noticed but preferring not to draw attention, he chose a booth by the window, from where he could watch the deserted street. Emma grabbed a menu and approached, noting his impeccable Italian shoes and the haircut that surely hadn't been done at the neighborhood barbershop. There was something almost predatory in the way he scanned the place, as if evaluating every detail. When Emma returned with the coffee, she set the cup gently on the table, trying not to make a sound. The man nodded briefly in acknowledgement, never taking his eyes off the window. The street was empty, only the occasional car leaving streaks of light on the wet asphalt from the fine drizzle that had begun to fall. It was strange to see someone so obviously wealthy in that part of town, especially at such an ungodly hour. Emma stepped back, giving him space, but her curiosity stayed sharp. Over the years working the night shift, she had developed the habit of inventing backstories for her solitary customers. This man could have come straight out of a corporate thriller, perhaps a CEO fleeing an imminent scandal, or a high-powered lawyer with dark secrets. It was a harmless game that helped pass the long hours. The coffee was just an excuse, she concluded. No one who looked like him would come to Rosie's for a mere cup of coffee. After a few minutes, the man made a discreet gesture, indicating he was ready to pay. Emma approached with the bill. As he reached into his coat's inner pocket for his wallet, something slipped and fell between them. A photograph. Emma bent down reflexively to pick it up, a courtesy that would change her life forever. The photo lay face up, and the smiling face froze her blood. It was her mother, Evelyn. There was no mistaking that gentle smile, those kind eyes that had guided her through childhood. It was a photograph she knew well. A nearly identical copy was stored in her memory box at home, in the small apartment she shared with a college roommate. In the photo, her mother looked younger, perhaps in her 30s, wearing the same necklace that would later become her trademark, a simple silver pendant that Emma had never seen her remove. The world around her seemed to slow, as if time itself was stretching. The sound of rain against the windows, the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, all faded into a distant murmur while Emma stared at the photograph in her hands. Her mother, Evelyn Mitchell, a simple black woman who had worked as a health aide all her life, living in a modest apartment on Chicago's South Side, who had never mentioned any connections to wealth or power. What was her photo doing in the wallet of a white billionaire? Emma's pulse quickened, pounding, in her ears like a drum. Her throat went dry. Without thinking of the consequences, she lifted her eyes, gripping the photograph tightly between her fingers. "Where did you get this?" she whispered hoarsely. The man looked at her for the first time, really looked, his intense blue eyes taking in every detail of her face. It was a moment of recognition, as if he had seen a ghost. His expression shifted for an instant. Shock, fear, guilt. Then, as swiftly as it had appeared, his face returned to its impassive mask. "You must be mistaken," he said in a controlled voice as he reclaimed the photograph. "Why do you have a picture of my mother?" Emma pressed, her voice gaining strength. The man extended his hand, his fingers brushing hers as he took back the photo. "You must be mistaken," he repeated, tucking the picture back into his wallet as if it meant nothing. Emma felt her stomach twist. She knew that image of her mother perfectly, every crease, every detail. It wasn't a mistake. "I'm not mistaken," Emma said firmly, louder now. "That's my mother, Evelyn Mitchell. Why do you have a picture of her?" Panic was rising in her chest. It made no sense. Her mother had never mentioned any ties to rich or powerful people. She had been a simple, hard-working woman who cared for elderly patients and raised Emma alone in a two-bedroom apartment on the South Side. The man exhaled sharply, adjusting his shirt cuff with a precise, almost rehearsed movement. "I owe you no explanation," he said, placing a $100 bill on the table, far more than necessary for a simple coffee. Before Emma could press further, he stood and headed for the door. There was something predatory in his movement, like a cornered animal about to flee. Panic seized Emma. He was walking away, taking with him the answers that could change everything she thought she knew about her mother. Without hesitation, Emma left the counter and ran to the door, nearly knocking over a tray in the process. Outside, rain had turned into a downpour, striking the asphalt mercilessly. The man was approaching a sleek black car parked at the curb, an odd sight in this rundown neighborhood. A driver stepped out to open the car door for him. "Wait!" Emma shouted, sprinting onto the sidewalk, ignoring the rain that immediately soaked her uniform. "Please!" Her voice trembled as she reached the curb's edge. "Just tell me how you know my mother." The desperation in her voice was raw, echoing down the empty street. For a brief moment the man paused, his hand resting on the car door. Emma dared to hope. He turned just enough to meet her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Forget it," he said in an emotionless voice. Then he slid into the vehicle, and the door closed behind him like a final verdict. The car sped away, leaving Emma alone under the merciless rain, drenched and trembling, not from the cold, but from an emotion she couldn't name. Anger, confusion, fear, maybe all of it. Her thoughts spun wildly as she returned inside the diner, droplets falling from her uniform and forming small puddles on the floor. Rosie, who had emerged from the kitchen at the commotion, gave her a worried look. "Are you all right, dear?" Emma only managed a mechanical nod, unable to explain what had just happened. How could she? She barely understood it herself. A billionaire had just left the restaurant carrying a photo of her mother, a woman who, so far as she knew, had nothing but a modest life dedicated to work and family. None of it made sense, and Emma knew with a certainty that burned through her veins that she couldn't simply ignore what had happened. That man had opened a door for her she could not allow to close. Emma didn't sleep that night. After her shift ended at 3 a.m., she returned to her cramped fourth-floor walk-up, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat at the small kitchen table, her laptop open before her, its bluish glow illuminating her determined face. Not even the constant drip of ancient pipes or the soft snore of her roommate could distract her from her mission. She needed to find out who that man was. She began searching for real estate magnates, CEOs of major companies, billionaire investors, anyone who matched the appearance and bearing of the diner patron. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed, a mixture of exhaustion, caffeine, and adrenaline coursing through her veins. The search felt endless. Dozens of names, faces, biographies on her screen, none corresponding to the man she sought. Hours crawled by, the sky gradually brightening outside her dingy apartment window, but Emma wouldn't give up. Determination grew in her with each passing minute, fueled by an inexplicable certainty. That encounter was no coincidence. There was a reason her mother's photo was in that man's wallet, and she would uncover it. It was when dawn's light finally filled the apartment that Emma found him. A Wall Street Journal article on the 50 most influential business people featured Richard Lawson, CEO of Strathmore Holdings, a sprawling billion-dollar empire with investments in technology, luxury real estate, and more. The accompanying photo left no doubt. It was him, the same man from the diner, with those piercing blue eyes and an unyielding expression. Emma's heart pounded as she devoured every line of the article, learning about the man who carried her mother's photograph. Richard Lawson, 58, had turned a small family civil engineering firm into one of the world's largest corporations. Single, with no known children, famed for calculated ruthlessness in business and strategic philanthropy. Born in Boston, educated at Harvard, with residences in Manhattan, the Hamptons, and Aspen. Nothing in the article linked him to Chicago, much less to the city's south side where Emma and her mother had lived. There was no mention of ties to everyday people, health aides, or anything that explained why he kept a photograph of Evelyn Mitchell. Emma felt a mix of triumph and frustration. She had identified the man, but that only led to more questions than answers. The following days passed in a blur of fatigue. Emma continued working her diner shifts, attending nursing classes, maintaining the facade of normalcy, while an obsession grew inside her. Richard Lawson consumed her thoughts. Every free moment was spent digging for any possible connection to her mother. Old articles, interviews, news stories, anything that might yield a clue. She slept only a few hours each night, often jolted awake by dreams of her mother and Lawson speaking in dark corners, always just out of reach. Her roommate, Jessica, began to notice the dark circles under her eyes, her moments of distractedness, the pile of coffee mugs in the sink. "Are you all right?" Jessica asked one morning as Emma stared out the window with red eyes. Emma merely nodded, unable to explain the whirlwind inside her. How could she tell someone that her entire family history might be built on secrets she didn't understand? The photograph had opened a wound she didn't know existed, a painful realization that she might not have known her mother as well as she thought. Exhaustion and frustration were nearly winning when Emma made an impulsive decision. If research wouldn't bring answers, she would go straight to the source. A quick search revealed the location of Strathmore Holdings headquarters, a sleek glass and steel skyscraper in Chicago's financial district. The next morning, instead of heading to her anatomy class, Emma dressed in her best clothes, a black pencil skirt and a white blouse she'd bought on discount and reserved for job interviews. She pinned her hair in a severe bun and applied minimal makeup, trying to look as professional as possible. The contrast between herself and the towering building before her could not have been greater. The Strathmore Tower loomed like a monument to power and wealth, its mirrored windows reflecting clouds and sky as if nothing in her world could penetrate that realm. Emma drew a deep breath, adjusted the strap of her worn purse on her shoulder, and forced her steps through the revolving glass doors into a marble lobby where her footsteps echoed like intrusions. The atrium was cavernous, with clean lines and minimalist elegance. Abstract artworks adorned the walls. Impeccably dressed executives moved with the confidence of belonging, and a receptionist with perfectly coiffed hair monitored the entrance from behind a curved desk. Emma tried to mimic their confidence as she approached the desk, though her heart pounded so loudly she feared it could be heard. "Good morning," she said, attempting a firmness she didn't feel. "I need to speak with Richard Lawson." The receptionist barely lifted her eyes from her computer, her fingers never ceasing their steady typing. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked in a tone that carried the certainty of an expected no. "No," Emma admitted, "but it's important." The woman finally glanced up, her eyes quickly assessing every detail, from Emma's scuffed boots to her patched purse, and concluding unmistakably that she didn't belong here. "Mr. Lawson doesn't meet with unscheduled visitors. You can leave your contact information, and someone from our team will reach out if needed." Emma knew she couldn't leave empty-handed. She inhaled deeply, feeling the marbles chill under her feet seep through her soles. With a dry throat and eyes still stinging from sleepless nights, she took a step forward and said what she had to. "Tell him Evelyn Mitchell is back." The receptionist stopped typing, and for the first time since Emma's arrival, Her gaze held on her for more than 2 seconds. It was impossible to tell whether the name had any real effect or if Emma's firm tone had simply pulled her out of autopilot. Without another word, the woman picked up the phone and dialed, subtly turning her body to keep the conversation private. Emma caught only muffled whispers, but she noticed the slight tension in the receptionist's jaw as she spoke. When the call ended, the woman looked back at Emma with a more cautious expression than before. "Please wait here," she said curtly, then disappeared through a side door, leaving Emma alone under the lobby's bright lights, every detail of her worn attire and fatigue standing out against the surroundings. Those were the longest 5 minutes of Emma's life. She stood there, motionless, her eyes locked on the gleaming marble floor that reflected her figure like a distorted mirror. She began to wonder if she had gone too far, if she had overstepped. She didn't belong in this world. She had known that the moment she stepped inside. Wearing a cheap skirt and worn shoes, surrounded by suited men who looked like they'd come straight out of a bank advertisement, and women who carried themselves with the unshakable confidence of inherent value, she tried not to feel out of place, but each passing second only amplified her sense of invisibility. The whole thing felt surreal. The diner encounter, her mother's photograph, the billionaire's hurried escape. And now here she was, in front of doors rarely opened to people like her, anxiety rising like a slow-burning fire, starting in her chest, climbing her throat, threatening to reduce everything to ashes if she didn't get an answer. A door clicked open, and a man in a dark grey suit appeared without introduction. He observed her for a moment, not with hostility, but with the practical curiosity of someone assessing an unexpected variable. "Mr. Lawson will see you," he said, "but only for 5 minutes." His voice was neutral, professional, and Emma simply nodded, unable to speak. She followed him down a silent corridor, her footsteps echoing slightly behind him. As she moved away from the lobby, she felt the familiar world slipping away. It was like crossing an invisible border where everything that was familiar, stale coffee smells, grease-stained uniforms, rushed mornings in the classroom ceased to make sense. She tried to still her thoughts, but they came in waves. What if this was a huge mistake? What if he really had nothing to do with her mother? And worse, what if she was about to learn something she couldn't unhear? The conference room where Richard Lawson awaited her was too large for an intimate conversation. The dark wood floor, high ceiling, and long glass tables surrounded by leather chairs, all empty. He stood by, the window wall overlooking the city. He didn't turn when she entered, but his reflection in the glass made it clear he knew she was there. Emma paused at the door for a few seconds before he spoke without facing her. "You really are Evelyn's daughter?" The question was direct, cold, almost cruel. Emma felt punched in the gut, not by the doubt, but by the way he said it, with no emotion, no guilt, as if analyzing a data point. She replied simply, "Yes." Then he turned, his blue eyes fixed on her, like scalpels. There was no surprise on his face. There was something more complex, recognition mixed with shame, and something Emma couldn't decode right away. For a moment, silence filled the space, the distant hum of the city below the only sound. Emma didn't know what she had expected from this meeting, but it wasn't this uncomfortable silence. Richard Lawson seemed smaller than in the diner, not physically, but in presence. In the restaurant, he had an almost untouchable aura, the type of person who commanded a room simply by walking in. Now, before her, he looked like a man trying to maintain control over something that had already slipped through his fingers. He walked to the table and placed his hands on its glass surface. His fingers were rigid, white with tension. "I didn't know she had a daughter," he said at last, each word seeming to cost him something. Emma felt a shiver down her spine. His admission sounded genuine, but it did nothing to lighten the weight of what it implied. He and her mother had known each other. They had had something, and for some reason he walked away. Perhaps that was why Evelyn never spoke of him, perhaps out of shame or protection. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. The instinct was to shout, to demand answers, to unleash everything bottled up since that early morning at the diner, but she knew that if she did, he would shut down. So she asked as simply as she could, "How did you meet my mother?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. "It was a long time ago, over 30 years. I was trying to step out of my father's shadow, build something on my own. I met Evelyn at a community event. She volunteered at a public health program. I was there representing a small construction company that could barely stay afloat then. She was different from anyone I'd ever known. Simple, straightforward, no patience for games. He smiled briefly at the memory, but it faded quickly. I fell in love, and I got terrified. Emma listened without looking away, but she felt emotions building like a storm behind her eyes. The idea of her mother, so steadfast, so grounded, being in love with a man like this was hard to process. Yet everything made a strange, unsettling sense. Evelyn never talked about that time. She always avoided questions about her romantic past. And the oddest part, she never dated anyone while raising Emma. You ran away from her, didn't you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Richard didn't deny it. He only looked down. I was a coward. My father threatened to cut off my financial support, and I had no means to live outside the family at the time. I told Evelyn I needed time, that I would fix things. When I came back to find her, she was gone. Emma's heart clenched. It sounded like a cheap soap opera script, but the pain in his eyes seemed real. She stepped around the table and took from her purse a small object wrapped in cloth. It was her mother's necklace, the silver pendant inscribed with "Forgive, Love, Begin." She placed it on the table between them. She never took this off. She wore it until the end. Richard stared at the pendant as if it were a ghost. He reached out but stopped midway, as if he no longer had the right to touch it. I gave that to her, the last day we saw each other. His voice faltered now, and Emma saw something break inside him. It wasn't just guilt. It was decades of regret. She gave me a chance to do the right thing, and I wasted it. For an instant, Emma saw past the billionaire persona to a man defeated by choices that could never be undone. And despite her anger, she recognized that pain. Emma didn't know whether she felt relief, anger, or sheer exhaustion. Seeing this broken man racked with memories she hadn't lived through was surreal, like watching a movie where she should have played a role, but never did. As genuine as Richard seemed, none of it erased the nights her mother returned home in tears without explanation. It didn't justify the silent birthdays or the Christmases when Evelyn said, "We already have everything we need." Emma grew up thinking it was enough, and in many ways it was. But now she knew there was a hole in that story, an emptiness filled with half-truths, silences, and a pain her mother carried alone until the end. Richard sank into one of the leather chairs, 40 years older than when he started. "I tried to find her, Emma," he said. "Once I was on my own, I invested time and money tracing her footsteps, but she vanished. No records, no address. It was like she erased her past." He paused before continuing. "Now I understand she was protecting me, protecting you." Emma bit her lip hard, fighting tears. The pieces fit together cruelly. Her mother always lived as though waiting for something from her past to return and haunt her. And now that something was right before her, begging for forgiveness it might never receive. Emma crossed her arms, forcing emotional distance. She couldn't simply erase everything, but she also couldn't deny its profound impact. "I didn't come here to reconnect," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just wanted the truth, to know if my mother was deceived or used. If you just went on with your life while she raised a child alone, paying late rent and splitting her last meal with me." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard stared at the pendant as if it bore more weight than he could bear. "I deserve every word of that," he said finally. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. I only want you to know that if you ever want, I'm here. Not as Strathmore's CEO, not as a billionaire, just as a man who made the biggest mistake of his life and is trying to face the consequences." Emma didn't answer immediately. It sounded honest, terribly honest, but the weight of everything was still too great. When she left the Strathmore building, the sky was grey, threatening rain. Emma hugged her coat tighter and wandered aimlessly through the cold streets of the financial district. People hurried past her, oblivious to what had just happened. She felt as if she had passed through a tunnel and emerged into another version of her life. The city was the same, but she was not. She had more questions than answers, more doubts than certainties. But something inside her had changed. She now knew who she was, or rather, where a part of her had come from. She didn't know if she would ever call Richard father. Maybe never. But she knew that, for the first time, the past no longer haunted her. It was staring her in the face, complete with name and story. And that, painful as it was, felt like a kind of liberation. That night, Emma returned home exhausted in a new way. not physically but emotionally drained, as if everything inside her was trying to realign after a silent earthquake. Her roommate, Jessica, lounged on the sofa, watching a cooking show, but switched it off the moment she saw Emma's state. "You look like you've been through a tornado," she said with a half-smile, trying to lighten the mood. Emma only murmured, "Long story," and went straight to her room. She locked the door, took off her shoes, and sat on the floor for several minutes, staring blankly at the wall. Everything she had experienced in the past 24 hours felt unreal. The photo, the pendant, the towering building, that man admitting he'd tried to find her mother. It was too much for someone who only wanted to understand why her mother had kept so many secrets. She opened the memory box beneath her bed, a ritual she had started after Evelyn's death. Inside were letters, old notes, photos, her first nursing school smock. It was her way to feel her mother's presence. Rifling through the contents, she found a letter she had never read, tucked at the bottom between two aged photographs. The handwriting was unmistakable, her mother's. With trembling hands, Emma unfolded the yellowed paper and began to read. It was addressed to her, undated, brief, but powerful. Evelyn wrote that there were things Emma would only understand when she was older, that she had loved deeply, but also suffered deep disappointment. That not all mistakes stem from malice, and sometimes silence is the only way to protect someone. Reading the letter unlocked something in Emma. She wept, not in a frantic, despairing way, but quietly, as if finally understanding a story that had always been half told. The letter didn't name Richard Lawson, but it spoke of a man who promised the world and vanished when she needed him most. It spoke of how Evelyn had to choose between living with anger or living with purpose, and she chose the latter for her daughter's sake. Emma felt torn between relief and pain. She now knew her mother had acted with intention and awareness, that her silence was not weakness, but a form of strength. And though it still hurt, it was comforting to know Evelyn had left some answers behind. Something for her to hold on to, as she tried to move forward with a new chapter of her own story in hand. In the days that followed, Emma settled back into her routine with a strange sense of clarity. She was still a waitress at Rosie's diner, still attending nursing classes, still living in the same apartment with its broken sink and noisy hallway, but something inside her had changed. She no longer felt her mother's absence as an endless void. Instead, it felt like a scar, something that still throbbed occasionally, but also reminded her of all they had been through. Richard Lawson had not tried to contact her again, and she didn't feel any rush to reach out to him. There was time. She needed to heal first, to understand what this all meant. It wasn't a story that demanded an immediate ending. It was something that had become part of her life, like the silver pendant, which she now wore every day, snug against her neck, not as a token of pain, but as a symbol of what had survived it. A few weeks later, after another diner shift, Emma spotted a brown envelope tucked under her car's windshield wiper. No return address, nothing written on the outside. For a moment, she considered tossing it aside. The trauma was still too fresh for more surprises, but something told her she should open it. She sat on the driver's seat with the interior light on and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Evelyn, younger, sitting on a park bench, smiling at someone just out of frame. Alongside it was a handwritten note from Richard. It was short but sincere. He said he had found the photo while sorting through old boxes in his Boston home. He didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted Emma to have that memory back. The letter ended with a simple request. "If you ever want to talk to no more, I'll be here, with time and regret." Emma held the photo for a few seconds, feeling a tightening in her chest. It was as if the past was gently making peace, step by step, without intruding. This was the first image of her mother smiling so spontaneously, so vibrantly, a version of Evelyn she'd never known. And for the first time, Emma felt she didn't have to respond immediately. She didn't have to decide in that moment whether to forgive, whether to open a space for that part of her family. All she needed was to keep that photograph safe, to protect it as her mother would have. There was something beautiful in not having all the answers. There was a quiet peace in finally accepting that not everything needs immediate resolution. Sometimes, acknowledgement alone is enough. The next day, during a break between nursing classes, Emma stopped by a small frame shop on her way home. She walked in, chose a simple light wood frame, and asked them to mount her mother's photograph. She carried the framed picture home and placed it on the little living room table next to the old radio Evelyn used to listen to. She stood there for a while, gazing at that woman's smile, someone who had faced the world alone, who had chosen silence as an act of love, who had raised a daughter with strength and dignity. Emma felt proud, not for confronting Richard, but for surviving the weight of the truth, for carrying on, for choosing not to be defined by absence. That night, before falling asleep, Emma wrote something in her journal for the first time in months. It wasn't a letter or an outpouring, it was just one sentence. I am made not only of what I lacked, but of what endured. Then she turned out the light and lay down, the silver pendant still around her neck and the framed photograph smiling beside the door. For the first time in a long time, she slept deeply and dreamed not of questions, but of possibilities.